Welcome back, Year 13. In my first video, we covered biography, context, themes, form and structure, and some of the previous questions. This time I'm going to focus almost exclusively on the comparatives. And then begin by looking at some practice questions which I've set you that you could think about tonight before the examination. But as I said, the main focus will be on comparatives. Now, when you are going to compare the poems, perhaps the most important thing to do is to have a very clear comparative statement, a kind of thesis that sums up either the similarity or the difference between the poems. Often this will be a contrast, because when you answer a question, in some ways you will agree with the statement, and in others you will try to counter it by showing that that is reductive and that a richer reading is needed, an alternative reading is needed. So if we had a question on the idea of the landscape as one of desolation, for instance, and we had the name poem Midterm Break, then I think it would be very good to compare or contrast this rather with Anna Horish. And if I was doing Midterm Break in terms of this idea of desolation, well, we'd have to say that it is one of the most evocative poems in terms of capturing emotional desolation that you can think of. Because after all, it is an obituary. It's an obituary to a small boy. And it begins masterfully, when we think about the sense of place, in a sick bay, where when he's at school, his day is interrupted. So the term midterm break is itself so evocative. When we think of midterm break, if we're a normal school person, we think about the joy of getting out of the institution, of the idea of getting away from school, particularly a boarding school. And it begins with him saying, counting knelling bells to a close. So we have the hard C consonants, we have the knelling, this idea of the symbolism of death, and the poem is told in these tight tercets with a very slow, deliberate rhythm. And as I say, this imagery, the semantic field of death and sickness saturates the poem. So rather than this being this happy escape from school. Now later there are all kinds of things that you might want to cover, but I think the most effective line for me is when his mother holds his hand and he has to go through this incredibly difficult moment where he has to really grow up. One of the things about Midterm Break is it's a rites of passage poem, and rites of passages are usually, or very often at least, painful. So he is catapulted from the world of childhood into being an adult world with awkward men shaking his hand, and here his mother relies on him, and she coughed out angry tearless sighs. It's a beautiful, long and complex phrase. Coughed and sigh seem to conflict with the hard C and the soft sibilant there. How does one cough a sigh? That complexity of the clashing metaphors actually makes it very hard to visualize, as well as the fact that you have an oxymoron here of angry and tearless. These two conflict, so it's a very complex, paradoxical image, which is also an example of synesthesia when you use one sense to describe another, something that I'll talk about a lot more because Heaney uses a great deal. And this kind of sense of grief and this idea of going beyond the vocal, beyond the sayable, is reinforced by this dehumanized image of the corpse, which is stanched and bandaged. So you have these horrible kind of sounds, don't you? The plosive bandaged. You've got the use of assonance and stanched in particular. This idea that his brother's body is like a wound and the flow of blood needs to be stanched is particularly effective, isn't it? And horrifying. And so the fact that it's called a corpse, I think is highly significant. And then we know that later in the poem, this kind of volta, where we have a time shift to the next morning, and then we have this beautiful, tender tone. Note the use of sibilants here, with snowdrops, candles, and the much softer C's here, and the beautiful onomatopoeic verb soothe the bedside. Okay, as though this personification really makes it as though we're looking at a cradle with a sleeping infant. But then we have a second volta where we go harsh again, and here Heaney uses the last line with devastating effect. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. It's a difficult line to say with all of the fricatives and the plosive there, and the fact that there's the use of a kind of antithesis and the use of the caesura in the middle of the line, cleaving the line, as though we feel this truncated, shortened life of his brother and the full bitterness. And we have to remember that there are two different narrators here. There's the Heaney who's writing the poem in the present many years later, angry, and there's the younger self trying to conceptualize and to deal with something that he is ill-equipped to do as a small boy who's been pulled out of boarding school. And now if we go across to Anahorish, we have a completely different idea, where there is no sense of the landscape being associated with desolation. Sometimes Heaney's poems about landscape are quite ambiguous. In Anahorish there is a sense of magic and beauty, and it begins with the idea of place of clear water. It's a simple line, but it's one that gives such a beautiful view. So much of Heaney's poem is about viscous things and mud and crusty things, but here we have this idea of purity. Now, Anahorish is not a name that would be found on ordnance maps, and it shows resistance, cultural resistance, that the people in the area still call it Anahorish. And the kind of simple beauty of this term Anahorish, if you say it to yourself, you feel the music in the Irish, don't you? And you realize that some things are untranslatable, and this is the magic of place names. Names that can take you back into the past and reconnect you with a cultural and linguistic ancestry that has been taken away from you on the official level of maps. Here the landscape and language meet in perfect harmony. He goes on to say, soft gradient of consonant. Now why this is so effective is in this poem, what Heaney does is he blends geography and linguistics. So he takes the semantic field of landscapes and geography and he merges it with a kind of linguistic landscape. And this produces a kind of bliss and a sense of the musicality of place and the essential linking between language and place, which we also see in New Song as well. And here he talks about Val Meadow. So again, we have this kind of synesthesia where we have spoken language materializing as a kind of meadow, almost like vowels of flowers or fauna or flora or geographical landscape. And it's enhanced by this beautiful sense of enjambment, this kind of flowingness of the land. And if we get anything on people, here we have the mound dwellers going deep in the mist. Now you could argue this different ways. You could say they're not named, they're distant people, they're not the current occupiers. But I think it's actually quite a human connection here. And what Heaney is doing is providing this kind of ghostly figures that he feels linked to, figures that he feels are part of his cultural ancestry. And here they appear before him incredibly evocatively. They come out of this landscape of Anahorish, and they seem to speak to him and show him that this is where he belongs, as opposed, I think it's implied, the colonial people who do not share this ancestry, this beautiful interlinkness to the landscape. I'm now going to move on to the idea of regeneration, which is another very important topic in Heaney. And this time my argument is going to be, in spite of the slaughter in Croppies, I'm talking about Requiem for the Croppies, there is evidence that the earth can regenerate, whereas in Bogweed, suffering results in a monstrous birth that threatens renewed violence and revenge. I want to pause to remind you how important it is that you compare the poems. So if the name poem is Croppies, it's fine to write about Croppies first entirely. But in that second paragraph, you must have an extended comparison. And this is what I'm trying to do by framing the question in the particular way that I am here. So if we're looking at this topic of regeneration and Croppies, what do we see? We see that it begins with a sense of absolute pride in resistance. It's noteworthy that Heaney is using a sonnet. Now sonnets, as we know, are usually love poems, and in the First World War, usually they are commemorations or requiems, just like Requiem of the Croppies. Don't forget that Requiem is a mass for the dead. So we know, don't we, from the beginning, that the fate of the Vinegar Hill rebels is foreshadowed by this title. It's a dramatic monologue with the rebels themselves speaking. The pockets of our greatcoats filled with barley. So we see here that they don't have a proper uniform. They contrast with the uniform regiments of the British that they face, who come with armaments and artillery and uniforms, and they're a proper army. Here we have a comparatively disorganized militia, and they are also starving and living on animal feed or dried barley, chewing it. We know that this poem comes from Door in the Dark, when the troubles are occurring in Ireland and we're moving towards some of the climaxes of them. In the second part of the poem, we see the Volta. And here's where the sonnet sharply changes. So it goes from the triumphant resistant to the idea of an outright massacre. We see that here with the trochaic line, terraced, the stress being on the first syllable with the strong T, terraced thousands died. It's a very stark statement. Until the hillside blushed. Now, if we're looking for these words that we really want to focus on, and symbols that we want to focus on and drill deep to get the AO2 language form and structure, here I think the term blushed is absolutely beautiful. Firstly, it's a complete slaughter. And what we could say is that the land itself is embarrassed by this, because the sides are so unequal, that this really is just murder and bloodshed. And it's almost like the landscape itself is embarrassed by this inequality and the slaughter that follows. On a more literal level, a blush is red, and so that really evocatively conjures up the idea that the earth is soaked with blood. Here I would argue that Heaney is showing his knowledge of World War I poetry, which frequently uses the idea of the red poppies of Flanders growing from the blood and being nurtured and fertilized by the blood of soldiers. And Heaney uses that to very powerful effect here. But in the final part of the poem, Heaney uses the final line, unlike Midterm Break this time, in a very hopeful way. And the line is filled with hope and resistance, because the barley grew up out of the grave. And so here we have the regeneration of the Irish crop. And the green shoots seem to stand for a kind of hardiness and endurance in the face of an overwhelming enemy, an organic resistance. And the suggestion here is that they can overcome. Now, the interesting thing, though, a contextual point worth mentioning, is that Heaney stops reading Croppies aloud at meetings when it starts to become seen as a poem that advocates for armed resistance. And that seems very interesting, because Heaney's position on resistance is not entirely clear, and I think you can see why Sinn Féin and members of the IRA were sometimes angered by the ambiguity and sophistication of his views. Now, what would we do in Bog Queen? Bog Queen begins with the corpse waiting between the turf face, which sounds like the Irish side of it, the farm, the turf that Heaney is so interested in, that we see in Bogland and elsewhere, that preserves Irish history, and the domain wall. Now, interesting, this is an Anglo-Norman spelling of the idea, an Anglo-Norman name that indicates possession. and Heaney is often used at fences and walls, etc., to show where the plantations first began. Another interesting contextual point as we think of Africans stolen to work on plantations in the United States, but the term plantations is first used in connection with Ireland, and seeing that kind of level of colonialization is very interesting, isn't it? And then what happens to the bog queen? It's like she suffers some kind of sexual assault. We see that Heaney deliberately draws off the semantic field of rape, with the sun groping her, illiterate roots finding their way into her, winter nuzzles at her thighs, okay? So it's as though she is kind of sexually harassed in death by the land itself, okay? It's very reminiscent of the poem Act of Union, where we see Ireland being pictured as female and being raped by the British. And as I said before, this seems to come out of this Ashling tradition of Gaelic poetry that often genders the Irish land as being female. Now, this kind of sexual attention, etc., leads to kind of a monstrous birth. And very interestingly, the key moment that brings the onset of the birth is a peer's wife. Now, the local gentry were usually Protestant because they were given the land over the Catholics. So here she takes a trophy from the bog queen and dehumanizes her, as was often the case with colonial people who would take skulls and different trophies, or whether they were hunting tigers in India. These were often seen as kind of talismanic, as allowing the people to show their victory by possessing these things over them, these trophies, okay? And here, when the birth occurs, the slimy birth cord is cut. We are not given an infant, we're not given a beautiful bit of barley growing through, green tendrils showing the fecundity of nature. Here we produce something horrible from the dead. Some kind of Frankenstein's monster, hacked bones, skullware, frayed stitches. It's coming up full of violence and vengeance, like some kind of horrific Magna Mater, female spirit of the earth, but one that is not coming to bring fruit and fertility, as was the case in so many depictions of the Magna Mater. Here it is a return of the repressed. And the fruits of this kind of sexual abuse, etc., appear to be violence. And they seem to be reflecting, Heaney seems to be reflecting on the violence that he sees all around him. Now, moving on to the question of imagination, I'm going to be looking at the poems Peninsula and Personal Helicon, and I'm going to begin with the thesis statement. In both Peninsula and Personal Helicon, Heaney explores landscapes that can stimulate the imagination and allow the artist to explore the depth of their unconscious mind. Now, I've had this one just to remind you that you can link through comparisons, and one of the things that you can do is to make a comparison and show like for like, and then part the poems later and show difference. So I might do that when I finish this section here. So in terms of imagination, the peninsula is a wonderful piece of landscape. Geographically, it stretches to the side of Ireland and has its own kind of unique geography, which exposes it to the elements, so it's more stormy and it's surrounded by ocean and tempestuous weather. And the poem begins in a kind of barren creative spell. It seems to be some kind of writer's block, when you have nothing more to say. So it opens in this flat, prosaic way, reflecting this lack of creativity. Just drive. And again, it's highly vernacular, but there's also a kind of sense of ease, and there's a kind of sense of advice through the use of the second person, with the poet speaking to us directly and giving us these simple instructions. Because the creativity and the idea of the muse is so much part of poetry, especially romantic poetry, where poets would call upon the muses to help them. And here the peninsula is acting as the muse, as stimulating the imagination of the poets. And what does he find? Well, the landscape is so sublime. Much of the Irish landscape is described as being fairly sedate and pastoral, but here we have the sublime. We have nature making you feel tiny and small, and this having a great effect at stimulating poetic imagination. Horizons drink down sea and hill, almost as though here we are in the landscape of Thor and the Norse people, and Loki and all of the Norse gods who are so huge, with islands riding themselves. That's a fantastic image, isn't it? Again, of these titan-like gods controlling things, and the landscape being so huge and vast and imposing. And what is the effect of this? You will remain silent. But when you return, you will uncode landscapes. Very interesting that he uses the term uncode, as though landscapes are puzzles and that you need to be able to think your way through them. And this will give you what he calls this cleanness. So a lovely link there, of course, would be, I think, to Anna Horish. If we think up here, I'm just thinking the place of clear water. And this idea that you are now renewed and regenerated, that could be another theme that you look at. Then going across to personal helicon, very different, because this is a confined dark space. Again, there's quite a prosaic beginning with him being attracted to wells. I love the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed. So whereas the peninsula is all about space, it's about the colossal, this is about smaller, darker spaces. And it clearly takes us into a kind of idea of a magical portal that takes us into another world, or perhaps into ourselves. One of the things I'm going to suggest is it seems very allegorical of a trip into the self. And we see this because the long roots from the mulch, with that beautiful nasal there, and that deep sh sound, the white face hovered. What is the white face? The white face is, of course, the self. And we have that together with the imagery of the echo. And of course, remember that the echo is often seen as a symbol of talking to oneself. So it seems highly allegorical. And that's reinforced by the fact that we have this allusion to Narcissus, the Greek, I won't say hero, the Greek figure, who is so in love with himself that he drowns admiring his own reflection. And Heaney says here, I rhyme to see myself. Now this is very interesting, because at other times Heaney has a very triumphant view of creation, as we see in the poem North, where the nub treasure of the pen allows you in some ways to break the history of violence. Here, however, Narcissus seems to be a much darker kind of self-involved idea of the artistic creation, and maybe linking a little bit more with punishment, where he describes himself disturbingly as a voyeur, almost getting pleasure, erotic pleasure, out of watching a woman's suffering. And now I'm going to move on to the idea of history. And in terms of history, I would be looking at North and Bogland. This time my controlling statement, my controlling comparative is in North, the landscape is imprinted with the violence of history, whereas in Bogland, the earth retains a rich sense of the past that celebrates the magic and endurance of the Irish past. Okay, it's a little bit awkward there with me repeating past, but I think you get the idea. In North, violence is imprinted in the land. In Bogland, there's this rich past, like a treasure trove museum that exists there for you. I'm going to make this our last comparative and then flick through the rest of them. Now, North begins with this wonderful Thor-like image of the hammered curve of the Bay of Ireland. Now, that sounds as though the landscape is metallic, and that Thor has taken his giant hammer and smashed and controlled and molded it. Now, why would he do this, and why would Heaney use this? Because it shows this connection to the dark. Remember, this comes out of North, the anthology North, and he speaks of the unmagical invitations of Iceland. Now, quite often Irish writers and poets have looked to Europe to remind themselves of their Catholic roots and their admiration for Latin or Greek culture. Here Heaney is looking to the north and reminding the Irish that that was a huge part of their heritage. So many Irish names like Waterford, etc., of course, are Norse names. And he uses a jamon here in a kind of terrifying way. There's a rhythmical kind of beating, a pulsating rhythm in this poem that shows this kind of inevitability. And here the jamon works to show this kind of, path and pattern of history moving towards this violence and cycles over and over again. And so we have the corpses measured against their long swords rusting. Even though the violence is old and the weapons are rusted, we feel that the vengeance and the desire for murder, etc., still exists. And here we see the long ships with their swimming tongue. Now that's very interesting, because a bit of this poem is going to be about language. But perhaps the greatest line of all is memory incubating spilt blood. Now, if we think about the word incubating, it usually means to produce life, doesn't it? As a hen incubates an egg to produce life, it provides warmth to result in kind of fertility and new life. But here, incubation is terrifying. It's a misuse of the metaphor, isn't it? Because it's going to produce more blood, more murder, more death, and more killing. Stunning phrase to use. Now, let's not forget the final part. There's a huge volta in North, where a voice comes out of nowhere and breaks this cycle of violence. And it speaks to Heaney about his art. Lie down in the word hoard, it says. Now, contextually, Heaney says that he was always trying to escape the tribal language of cliché and hatred, and try to find a language that would make people more reflective and maybe above this fray, this sectarianism and tribalism. And that's why he says that he will maintain a clear eye and he looks towards his nubbed treasure. So as I said, in Punishment, we have this idea of the artist as a voyeur. In Personal Helicon, we have the artist as Narcissus, simply looking at himself and echoing. Here's a much more grandiose and epic idea, something more like romantic poetry, where the artist has a role in the world. Percy Shelley, the romantic poet, said that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And here, Heaney seems to be, maybe a slightly paler version, be hinting at this idea that art can have a prophetic quality, that maybe it can break the cycle of violence, and that it can make people more reflective. Now, how would we contrast this with Bogland? Well, we know in North we see this terrible cycle of violence, but in Bogland it begins with no prairies, so it begins with a deficit. Heaney writes about this in Westring as well, this vast American landscape. Well, we don't find it in Ireland, he tells us, apart from in the peninsula, perhaps, to slice a big sun at evening. So we don't have this vast continent of the United States. What do we have? We have this incredible space beneath the earth, which is like a kind of rich archaeological treasure, a kind of museum, a memory of life that extends thousands of years. And he goes on to say, in the unfenced country, the bog keeps crusting and melting. So you've got these gerunds over here melting and crusting, producing this black butter. Now, some students feel that this is a kind of a negative idea. To me, it seems to be that the earth is retaining a kind of memory of the culture that came before it, and that this would have an incredible importance to a colonial or a post-colonial writer like Heaney, who's trying to rediscover his culture, a culture that has been smashed and that the Imperial British have tried to eliminate. And here he's rediscovering it. And what does he find? He finds strength and longevity. And finally, there is this kind of triumphant note. Our pioneers, again, he's drawing upon the lexical kind of structure that one would associate with the United States, with this idea of prairies and discoveries, etc. So they don't have this frontier that is that goes outwards. They go inwards and downwards. So it's a kind of celebration of archaeology and historians. The wet center is bottomless. He says also earlier that they will never drill oil here. So you cannot just commercialize it. You cannot take it as imperialists do and just try and monetarize it. This bogland resists colonial rule and materialism. And the space beneath instead yields for everyone the rich Irish history that will be so important in terms of this new, in terms of the country rediscovering itself and making itself new and fresh. Now, I'm just very briefly going to say that I think you could pause the screen and look at this one here, where I am also looking at language. I'm contrasting New Song with North, and New Song is a very beautiful poem, very interesting, because it eroticizes the landscape, but it also shows a kind of linguistic richness of the landscape. There's a promise here of an erotic promise of the rediscovery of culture flowing out of the banks, etc. And that is so different from North, where there is a celebration of language, but the poet has to lie down in a word burrow and hide. And it's much more of an individual retreatist idea. In terms of birth, I think it's very interesting to look at Groibel Man, where he weeps, where he's bruised like a forceps baby. So he's infantilized in this way. And we're left with this terrible idea of the hooded victim slashed and dumped, which reminds Heaney of the dying Gaul, the statue of pain and agony. And so we see all the equivalents there, firstly of the Groibel Man himself, but also of Roman imperialism and the slow murder and garroting. It's a fantastic statue, if you look at it, of the dying Gaul. And in Act of Union, we have a different birth, where here this rape results in an unwanted pregnancy and then a birth wound with a totally unwanted child, parasitical and ignorant fists. Now this is a description of the Orangemen, the Ulstermen, filled with rage, a child not wanted by his father, the British, or his mother, who obviously rejects him. And there, this is where the fifth column is, this legacy of the rape that will not go away and that really is imprinted there in this impossible situation. Now I'm just going to end the video by just talking about some of the questions that might come up, connecting the landscape with death. You should, to what extent do you support the view that Heaney always finds signs of resistance? So I think resistance is another big one, resistance and regeneration. Heaney invariably celebrates the past rather than looking to the future. That's an interesting one. In spite of the dark moments, Heaney invariably finds hope in the Irish landscape. Well, that's a really interesting one. I think you'd be able to do that. And in terms of gender, Heaney sees the Irish landscape as a female body that has been violated. I think you could answer both ways. Just to end on a quick plenary, it's really important that in the introduction that you set up a debate and you set up at least two arguments where you say, in this way I'm going to agree with the statement using this poem or these poems, and in this way I'm going to depart from it. So make sure you always have this counter thesis. Please use topic sentences, signpost to the examiner what you're going to do in that paragraph. Use comparative clincher sentences to end paragraphs, okay? And we've done a lot of context today, biographical, thematic, and in terms of socio-political. Try to integrate this, but don't write little history essay bits. Make sure that it fits in with the AO2 and that it helps to enhance your interpretations rather than pad out your essays. And use the conclusion to answer the question in a succinct and interesting way. Best of luck in your exam tomorrow. I completely believe in you, and I know that this will be a success.